For decades, U.S. companies trying to cut costs and stay competitive have resorted to offshoring, sending jobs and sometimes their entire operations to China and other faraway places where they can make their products for less. But recently, some companies have started to rethink where they want to be, with rising U.S.-China tensions and painful pandemic lessons about what happens when your product is stranded thousands of miles away from your customers. And now jobs are coming back west. Instead of offshoring, we've got the reverse. It's being called nearshoring, because who doesn't love a catchphrase? The key word here, though, is near. A lot of those jobs aren't quite coming all the way back. Bloomberg's Leda, Alvim, and Averbuch report that hundreds of companies serving American consumers are instead relocating to Mexico, much closer than Asia, but still less expensive than operating in the U.S.
You can literally drive from Mexico for the city of Monterey to the U.S. border in less than 3 hours without hitting one single red light. So that's one of the big selling points.
I think what's kind of funny about it is that you can walk into an industrial park like that and you have like a giant cookie maker next to an auto parts maker. And they're all really there for the same purpose, which is that there's land, it's near the border.
I'm Wes Kosova. Today on The Big Take, Mexico is open for business. Leda, I had no idea that there was so much business and industry pouring into Mexico right now. Why exactly is this happening?
So it all started with tensions between the U.S. and China. Since the pandemic, it's been rewiring global trade around the world. And now people and companies are looking to change and expand their operations closer to where their client is. So a lot of companies that we're seeing and what we talk about in the story is they're moving or expanding operations in Mexico as a way to serve the U.S.
For a lot of years, we heard about offshoring, this idea that you move production overseas where it's cheaper. And this seems to be the exact opposite of that.
So now we're seeing the trend of nearshoring. And Mexico is in the center of this new trend, especially the northern region of Mexico, including the state of Nuevo León, where Monterey, in the capital, Tesla announced a $5 billion investment to build its new gigafactory.
Even with these tensions, why is it an advantage to be in Mexico?
Obviously, the U.S. is a huge market. That means U.S. consumers are buying products from around the world. If they're in Mexico, and especially in northern Mexico, they can just drive across the border. And it's a convenient bet for a lot of companies, also because it's cheaper to produce in Mexico than in the U.S. And so not all companies are moving to Mexico, but there's certainly companies that are looking at the country and thinking, I'm going to be a few hours from the U.S., I can appeal to different markets in this way, and I can guarantee to my customers that they're not going to have supply chain disruptions in the way that they did in the pandemic.
And you spoke to people involved in operating some of these businesses in Mexico. Here's one of them.
My name is Jose Maria Garza. I'm the CEO and president of GP Development and Construction, Monterey, Mexico, northeast of Mexico. Remember, we got 1,900 miles of border with the U.S., which is the largest market in the world. And based on the U.S. and free trade agreement Mexico had, a lot of companies established in Mexico, not only to supply the U.S. market, also to supply the world.
Maya, aside from Mexico just being close to the U.S., you write that there are a lot of advantages to moving a company to Mexico.
Mexico is a country that's been developing manufacturing, especially near the border, since the 60s. And it's had this massive trade deal with Canada and with the U.S. since the 90s. And so this is not like a new game for Mexico. The auto industry was already here. And so when auto companies are talking about switching to EVs and are talking about selling EVs to U.S. consumers, for many of them, it's re-outfitting operations that they already have. A lot of the investment that's coming into Mexico from foreign companies is also building on plants that are already here. There are companies that are adding a second or a third plant. And so they kind of have the know-how of what Mexico looks like. It's a country, again, where a lot of people work in manufacturing. It's a big source of employment. There are a lot of trained engineers. There's a lot of people who are looking to work in these industries. And so for companies who are moving here or trying to expand operations, that's an advantage. And then for all those little companies or mid-sized companies, they're part of a chain, right? So a company like Tesla might move to Mexico and it brings with it other companies in its wake. It needs suppliers for all its different parts. It needs someone to make the plastic components, the metal components in every car. And Tesla's not going to do all of that itself. So the kind of assembly work that happens in these big manufacturing centers in Mexico is something that Mexico has been doing for decades and that it's really good at. And companies want to keep doing that here, but at a bigger scale now.
You can literally drive from Mexico for the city of Monterey to the U.S. border in less than 3 hours without hitting one single red light. So that's one of the big selling points of Mexico bringing those companies and attracting those investments into the region, which also raises an issue that even the government has been actively talking about. It's how the investment across the country is a little bit divided between the north region and the south. So we see a lot of even the government itself trying to pull more investments from companies abroad to the southern regions, which hasn't been a lot of the case because if all those companies are coming to the northern region, they also are facing some certain challenges because of that big demand. And we see that with industrial park space. We see that with the challenges around infrastructure and how it's not able to keep up with that big demand. And they're trying their best to speed up the investments around, but many still think that it's not enough and there's still more to do. The current governor of the president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who is known as AMLO, is focusing its last term in office on building and developing its big project of a railroad that will connect both the Pacific and the Gulf of Mexico. And they're selling that it will rival the Panama Canal.
And I want to talk a little bit more about some of those big challenges that Mexico is facing now that so many companies are flocking there. But first, let's talk a little bit more about what kinds of companies are showing up in Mexico. And Maya, you talked a little bit about Tesla. And one of the things that just stood out to me in your story was the incredible gravitational pull that Tesla's new plant there has brought and how many other companies are coming in to support it.
The economy minister of the state, Ivan Rivas, told us that he estimated that some 30 companies had moved to the state in the last few years, both because of the Tesla plant that's going to be built in Mexico and another Tesla factory that was built in Austin, Texas. And so these are the parts suppliers, right? These are the people who make the windshield and the brakes and the machines that make it possible for there to be self-driving cars on the road. Obviously, a lot of those providers don't just sell to Tesla. They can sell the same kinds of products to all different kinds of companies. And so you see companies that sell some products to the autos market, some products to other people, and they're working with plastics and metals. And so, yeah, Tesla has kind of been a selling point for the government. There was a lot of hype.
Later, with all these companies coming to Mexico, how much is all this investment worth?
Well, the Mexican economy has been recording export figures over the last few months as a result of this nearshoring boom. Just an example, in May, shipments rose 5.8% from a year ago, reaching $52.9 billion and recording the second highest print on record. Just this year in January has been record-breaking for Mexico in these terms of exports. And even to put into some context, when we talk about this foreign direct investment, is how much are we seeing in Mexico coming in? Mexico received $29 billion in foreign direct investment in the first half of 2023, in which most of that money comes from the U.S. since it's the number one buyer of goods. And the amount represents just 41% increase from that same period a year before. And even by sector, 57% is manufacturing. So we definitely see that shift.
I would also just say we talk a lot about autos because they're these huge consumer products for the U.S., because there's this shift to EVs and incentives in the U.S. for people to do that, and some of those cars are being made in Mexico. And the auto and transportation sector was responsible for $150 billion of exports from Mexico to the U.S. this year. But we also see things like computers and electronics and furniture. And there's this huge increase in exports of beverages and tobacco. So there's this real diversity of products that are going from Mexico to the U.S.
And another thing that you talk about that's really very interesting, especially when we're talking about the relationship between the U.S. and China, is how many of the companies moving to Mexico that are Chinese companies.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that Chinese companies sell to all kinds of different suppliers, and they don't want to be left out. Those Chinese companies want to be part of exporting to the U.S., and if they're operating in Mexico, they're not going to be facing the same kinds of tariffs as if they were producing still in China.
And Leda, you write that this is kind of one way that China is keeping its hand in and not losing out on all that business, even if they're not producing it at home.
Right. They want to follow that trend. And just to mention that this past month in China was very tough in general with the slowdown and the economic troubles, which is putting Mexico in an even better position in terms of its relationship to the U.S. We're seeing that Mexico is being uplifted by it, and it's boosting its position and its relationship with the U.S. And just in July, it officially became the biggest import for the U.S., surpassing China that has for long been the number one.
One study from the bank BBVA suggested that in the next couple of years, 1 in 5 foreign investments in Mexico would come from Chinese companies. So they're having this growing role in new investments in the country. And while other companies are expanding, it looks like the new ones that are moving in definitely include a lot of these Chinese firms.
After the break, with so many new factories cropping up, does Mexico have the infrastructure to handle it? Maya, we mentioned earlier that all of this investment that companies are bringing are also coming with a certain amount of headaches that Mexico wants them to come, but they don't have the infrastructure to support all of this industry yet. What are they doing about that?
Companies have to make a decision about whether they're willing to run into certain kinds of risks when they're deciding to invest, because these are long-term investments. So one of the issues is a shortage of water. There was a huge drought that affected northern Mexico last year, in Monterey specifically, where we're seeing this huge business boom. There are a lot of people without water for many days on end. And there's some kinds of solutions, like the government is working on building a new aqueduct to the city to bring more water to it. But that's not going to get rid of drought or get rid of climate conditions that are making this part of the country difficult. AMLO's government has said, well, why don't companies go to states where there's more water? It's going to be easier to guarantee them a supply. And that there's a population issue, which is if you build a bunch of factories, you need people to work in those factories, and those people are going to need water, and the country simply might not have it in certain states that have traditionally been the hotbeds of investment, manufacturing, and therefore exports. The other issues are things like the electricity grid. We talked to one manager at a plant who talked a lot about the headache of having power outages and the fact that he had to scrap some of the products that they were developing because their production lines would suddenly shut down. And Mexico is certainly working on expanding its grid. There's been a big battle during this administration of exactly who should be responsible for electricity production and distribution, whether the state should have a bigger role or private industry should have a bigger role, whether renewables should have a bigger part in the industry as well. And we've seen some companies try to find workarounds. They can produce some amount of their own electricity, but not the bulk of it for the scale of operations that we're talking about.
Hello, my name is Pedro Campa. I'm responsible for the operations of Quanta in Mexico. There's plenty of people talking about nearshoring. There's plenty of people talking about what says made in China can say in the future made in Mexico. But I don't see, and this is my personal opinion, I don't see an integral strategy, let's put it that way, from our federal authorities together with the state authorities about how to facilitate those processes of being set up in Mexico. So nearshoring is going to happen to Mexico. Don't know if it's going to happen to the potential.
Leda, I guess another thing that they're facing is just finding enough workers. In the U.S., where there's also a lot of investment going into building chips and cars and other sorts of products, finding people who are skilled to do that work has been a real challenge. Does Mexico have enough people to fill out the ranks of all these companies?
I think it's a constant growth. When we went to Monterey, one of the selling points as well that they advertise is the skilled workforce. They talk about a lot of their universities and how it's very specialized for their teachings and how much they can add to the workforce coming into this production.
It depends if you need to hire sort of an engineer specialized in certain computers, or if you need to hire sort of assembly line workers who are going to be manually putting together parts. Certainly Mexico has a lot of workers, and there's a competition between companies. We've heard about companies training workers and then having those same workers be poached by other companies because there is a high level of demand right now. Unemployment in Mexico is at historic lows at the moment because there's such a great desire for this workforce. And, that doesn't mean that there aren't still people leaving Mexico to go work in the U.S. where there are much higher wages. But it does mean that part of what's attractive about some of these big cities that already have a lot of manufacturing or experience in aerospace or in electronics is that they do have a certain amount of trained people.
We've talked about how the U.S. is glad that a lot of these companies are moving to Mexico away from China, but is there any tension with the U.S.? Joe Biden has a big plan to try to bring back a lot of manufacturing to the U.S. Is the U.S. at all trying to lure those companies not to Mexico, but to the United States?
This is a tricky thing for the U.S. government. We've seen some firms look at both Mexico and the U.S. and in the end have to make a decision about where they're going to end up. So we know that there is a certain amount of competition at the level of individual companies who are kind of going on tours and trying to figure out what's convenient for me. That said, this is a three-way trade agreement between Mexico, the U.S., and Canada. In theory, it is still beneficial for the U.S. government to have these companies moving to North America. Certainly, as you said, it might not want a big chunk of those companies to be Chinese companies, but it does want to have availability of products. And there's a lot of back and forth production, right? There's certainly some industries where we see plans for cross-border production, like with semiconductors. But investing in one place doesn't necessarily mean leaving out the other.
Leda, another question that often comes up about Mexico is crime, especially the drug cartels and violence. How does that enter into the calculations that companies thinking about Mexico are making?
They say while it's still a concern, it's not yet the stopping point for us to be like, we're moving to the U.S. or we're not thinking about Mexico. But many say that the benefits outweigh the risks in terms of what Mexico has been facing. So when they look at it, they look in the bigger picture. And when they plan to expand their operations in North America, they still see that Mexico has a better value with labor costs and the production. And they do make that decision to continue despite the challenges.
Here's Jose Maria Garza again. He's the CEO and president of GP Development and Construction.
Well, if you look at it from our perspective, construction and real estate is cheaper here than the U.S. Leases are less here than the U.S. We have access to the same finance, and our construction cost is way lower. I will say 40-50% lower than the U.S. And manufacturing costs here in Mexico Steel, we are very, very competitive worldwide. We can compete with any country in the world.
When we come back, Maya and Leda tell us what this business boom looks like on the ground in Monterey. Later, you mentioned how you and Maya went to Monterey, which is the site of so much of this activity. What's it like there? What did you see?
It's a boom town. It's a city that is continuously growing, and it's very industrial. You drive around the roads, and you see big trucks just clogging the highways.
Yeah, I mean, I think the developers are super excited about the amount of growth that is happening. It also means that the city is growing outwards. And so there are huge industrial areas where developers are trying to put up buildings that they think they can sell really quickly, and they can think they can sell them when they're half done, when there's no windows, when there's no ceiling yet, there's no doors. But there are companies that are interested enough that they'll put money down and say, okay, I want that building. Other companies are buying space instead of renting. Rental times have gone up. And so you walk around between these massive buildings that are in the middle of construction zones but are still operating. Companies that are already there are putting up new buildings nearby. And so everything looks a little bit half finished. And it's really hot in summer, I have to say. That's another challenge for people who live and work there. And all of these trucks are kicking up dust on their way to the border, and they get stuck in traffic jams. And you can see people from different parts of the world who have sent representatives to try to figure out, is Mexico the right place for us? Or are all these other factors, the heat, the building space that isn't that available right now, the electricity, the crime, whatever it is, are going to make it not that preferable.
And so we have all this activity pouring into Mexico. And yet, one of the things you write is that there's a concern that this could be a cautionary tale, that Mexico has seen this kind of growth in the past and it didn't last.
I think there was an idea in the 90s and even before that exports were going to be the big answer for the Mexican economy, that it was going to turn into this great manufacturer, and this would make all the difference for its population, that people would be better off, essentially, because of all of this manufacturing. And that didn't exactly turn out as maybe the politicians at the time expected, since NAFTA went into effect in 1994, which is the free trade agreement between Mexico, the U.S., and Canada. I think Mexico since then has had growth on average of about 2%, which is okay, but it also means that it's been surpassed in growth by other countries that were doing worse than it at the start of the century, countries like Turkey or Poland or Malaysia that are now better off. And so I think there's this sense in Mexico that maybe the bet on cheap labor in manufacturing and exports to the U.S. didn't exactly work out. There's still millions of people in poverty. There are certain government programs that have helped to reduce the poverty figure, but over a third of the country still lives in poverty. And a ton of people migrate still because they don't have enough work opportunities. And there's a big division in the country, and obviously a lot of states where the trade agreements have not worked in their favor. There are places that had a lot of agriculture, small-scale agriculture of different kinds, that were affected by all of the imports from the U.S., things like U.S. corn. And those areas of the country weren't benefited by the trade agreement signed in the 90s. There have been efforts since then to revise the trade agreement, to make sure that it's more beneficial, to make sure that there's more attention to labor rights. But fundamentally, this is still a bet on exports, right? It's a bet that exporting more will make Mexico richer, and if it becomes richer, the people who live there will become richer. That hasn't exactly turned out to be the case. So I think there's this big question of who is going to end up benefiting. Is it going to be the foreign companies who are getting a really good deal because they are moving to a country that still has a lower cost labor force? They're finding open land that they can develop and they can continue to the export to the U.S. market? Or is it Mexico and Mexicans who are working in all of these factories who are going to end up benefiting?
Leda, when you look down the road a year from now, 5 years from now, where do you see this story heading?
I think Mexico will still be looking to continue to enjoy this opportunity with nearshoring as it attracts more companies coming into the country and take advantage of that. It's a big moment for Mexico. Now it's a matter of how they're going to take advantage of it. For next year's, we're seeing exports surging and hitting records. We'll continue to see that trend moving forward, especially as companies establish themselves and officially begin operating in the country in the coming years. So I think going into next year's elections, it's a matter to see what are the candidates' plans to continue this trend of nearshoring and to continue to attract the companies so that Mexico can fully take advantage of this moment that's been presented and not repeat history as it's been for the last few years.
I think it's also an interesting election race, right? We have two leading women candidates, the candidate for the party of the president and the candidate for the opposition. So it's pretty likely that Mexico will have a woman president for the first time starting at the end of 2024. Certainly, both of these candidates are promising that they're women of the people, that they are going to pay attention to poverty, to the security issues, and that they are going to make sure that the country keeps growing. But exactly how they plan to do that, we don't know yet.
Hopefully we get our act together and whatever is saying made in China becomes made in Mexico soon.
Leda, Maya, thanks so much. This was just fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to us here at The Big Take. It's a daily podcast from Bloomberg and iHeartRadio. For more shows from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. And we'd love to hear from you. Email us questions or comments to bigtake@bloomberg.net. The supervising producer of The Big Take is Vicky Vergolina. Our senior producer is Catherine Fink. Rebecca Chasson is our producer. Our associate producer is Sam Gabauer. Raphael Amsili is our engineer. Our original music was composed by Leo Sidran. I'm Wes Kosova. We'll be back tomorrow with another Big Take.